This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Joyce Nussbaum, Highland Park, New Jersey. Good Things to Eat as Suggested by Rufus Estes. Section 13, Rolls, Bread, and Muffins. Breakfast rolls. Sift a quart of flour and stir into it a saltspoonful of sugar, a cup of warm milk, 2 tablespoonfuls of melted shortening, and 2 beaten eggs. Dissolve a quarter of a cake of compressed yeast in a little warm milk and beat in last of all. Set the dough in a bowl to rise until morning. Early in the morning make lightly and quickly into rolls and set to rise near the range for 20 minutes. Egg rolls. 2 cups flour, 1 level teaspoon salt, 2 level teaspoons baking powder, 2 level teaspoons lard, 2 level teaspoons butter, 1 egg, 1/2 cup milk. Sift together the flour, salt, and baking powder. Work in the shortening with the fingers. Add the egg well beaten and mixed with the milk. Mix well, toss onto a floured board and knead lightly. Roll out and cut in 2-inch squares. Place a 1/2 inch apart in a buttered pan. Gash the center of each with a sharp knife. Brush over with sugar and water and bake 15 minutes in a hot oven. Excellent tea rolls. Scald 1 cup of milk and turn into the mixing bowl. When nearly cool, add a whole yeast cake and beat in 1½ cups of flour. Cover and let rise. Add 1/4 cup of sugar, 1 level teaspoon of salt, 2 beaten eggs, and 1/3 cup of butter. Add flour enough to make a dough that can be kneaded. Cover and let rise. Roll out 1/2 inch thick, cut in rounds, brush 1 heel each with melted butter, fold and press together. Set close together in the pan, cover with a cloth, let rise, and bake. Light luncheon rolls. Heat 1 cup of milk to the scalding point in a double boiler. Add 1 rounding tablespoon of butter, 1 level tablespoon of sugar, and 1 level teaspoon of salt. Stir and set into cold water until lukewarm, then add 1 yeast cake dissolved in 1/4 cup of lukewarm water and 2 cups of flour. Beat hard for 2 or 3 minutes, cover, and let rise until very light. Add flour to make a dough that can be kneaded and let rise again. Knead, shape into small rolls. Set them close together in a buttered baking pan, let rise light, and bake in a quick oven. A pan of rolls. Scald 1 pint of milk and add 1 rounding tablespoon of lard. Mix in 1 quart of sifted bread flour, 1/4 cup of sugar, a saltspoon of salt, and 1/2 yeast cake dissolved in 1/2 cup of lukewarm water. Cover and let rise overnight. In the morning roll 1/2 inch thick, cut into rounds, spread a little soft butter on 1/2 of each, fold over and press together. Let rise until light and bake in a quick oven. Rolls may be raised lighter than a loaf of bread because the rising is checked as soon as they are put into the oven. Raised graham rolls. Scald 2 cups of milk and melt in it 2 level tablespoons of butter and 1/2 level teaspoon of salt. When cool, add 2 tablespoons of molasses and 1/2 yeast cake dissolved in a little warm water. Add white flour to make a thin batter, knead until smooth, and set in a warm place until light. When well risen, stir in wholemeal to make a dough just stiff enough to knead. Knead until elastic, then place it in the original bulk. Flour the board and turn the risen dough out carefully. Pat out 1 inch thick with the rolling pin and make into small rolls. Place these rolls close together in the pan, brush over with milk and let rise until very light. Bake in a quick oven. Rye breakfast cakes. Beat the egg light, add 1/2 cup of sugar, 2 cups of milk, a saltspoon of salt, 1 1/2 cups of rye meal, 1 1/2 cups of flour, and 3 level teaspoons of baking powder. Bake in a hot greased gem pan. Breakfast cakes. Sift 1 cup of cornmeal, 1/4 teaspoon of salt, and 2 level teaspoons of sugar together. Stir in 1 cup of thick sour milk, 1/2 tablespoon melted butter, 1 well-beaten egg, and 1/2 teaspoon of soda, measured level. Beat hard and bake in gem pans in a quick oven. Scotch oat cakes can be either fried on a griddle or broiled over a fire. The meal for this purpose should be ground fine. Put a quart of the meal in a baking dish with a teaspoonful of salt. Pour in little by little just enough cold water to make a dough, and roll out quickly before it hardens into a circular sheet about 1/4 of an inch thick. Cut into 4 cakes and bake slowly for about 20 minutes on an iron griddle. Do not turn but toast after they are cooked. Scotch scones. 2 cups flour, 4 level teaspoons baking powder, 2 level teaspoons sugar, 1 level teaspoon salt, 3 level tablespoons butter, 1 whole egg or 2 yolks, 1 cup buttermilk. Sift together the flour, baking powder, sugar, and salt, and work in the butter with the fingers. Then add the buttermilk and egg well beaten. Mix well, turn onto floured board, and knead lightly. Roll out 1/2 inch thick. Cut with small biscuit cutter and cook on a hot griddle, turning once. Log cabin toast for breakfast. This is made up of long strips of bread cut to the thinness of afternoon tea sandwiches, then toasted a delicate brown. All are buttered lightly and piled on a hot plate log cabin fashion. Old-fashioned rusks. At night make a sponge as for bread with 2 cups of scalded milk, a teaspoon of salt, yeast, and flour. In the morning put 1/2 cup of butter into 2 cups of milk and heat until the butter is barely melted. Add this to the sponge, 1 cup of sugar, and 3 beaten eggs. Add flour to make a dough that can be kneaded. Let rise very light. Roll out 1½ inches thick, cut in round cakes, let rise, and bake a deep yellow color. Waffles Southern style. 1 pint of flour, 1 pint buttermilk, 1 egg, 1/2 teaspoon soda dissolved in little water, 1 teaspoon sugar, 1 teaspoon salt, 1 teaspoon baking powder, 1 tablespoon cornmeal, 1 tablespoon melted butter. Mix as any other batter cake or waffles. Whole wheat popovers. Put 2/3 cup of whole wheat meal, 1 2/3 cup of white flour, and 1/2 level teaspoon of salt into a sifter and sift 3 times. Pour 2 cups of milk on slowly and stir until smooth. Beat 2 eggs 5 minutes, add to the first mixture and beat again for 2 minutes. Turn into hot greased iron gem pans and bake 1/2 hour in a rather quick oven. Berry muffins. Mix 2 cups sifted flour, 1/2 teaspoon salt, and 2 rounded teaspoons baking powder. Cream 1/4 cup of butter with 1/2 cup sugar, add well-beaten yolk of 1 egg, 1 cup milk, the flour mixture, and white of egg beaten stiff. Stir in carefully 1 heaped cup blueberries which have been picked over, rinsed, dried, and rolled in flour. Bake in muffin pans 20 minutes. Buttermilk muffins. Sift 4 cups of flour, 1/4 cup of cornmeal, and 1 level teaspoon each of salt and soda 3 times. Beat 2 eggs well, add a level tablespoon of sugar, 4 cups of buttermilk, the dry ingredients, and beat hard for 2 minutes. Bake in muffin rings or hot greased gem pans. 1/2 the recipe will be enough for a small family. English muffins. 1 pint milk, 2 level tablespoons shortening, butter or lard, 2 level teaspoons sugar, 1 level teaspoon salt, 1 yeast cake dissolved in 1/4 cup lukewarm water, flour. Scald the milk and add the shortening, sugar, and salt. When lukewarm, add the yeast and sufficient flour to make a good batter. Here one's judgment must be used. Beat well and let rise until double in bulk. Warm and butter a griddle and place on it buttered muffin rings. Fill not quite half full of the batter, cover and cook slowly until double, then heat the griddle quickly and cook for about 10 minutes, browning nicely underneath. Then turn them and brown the other side. When cool, split, toast, and butter. Graham muffins. Heat to the boiling point 2 cups of milk, add a tablespoon of butter and stir until melted. Sift 2 cups of whole wheat flour, 1/2 cup of white flour, 2 teaspoons of baking powder. Pour on the milk and butter, beat, add the yolks of 2 eggs well beaten, then the stiffly beaten whites. Bake in hot greased gem pans. Hominy muffins. Sift twice together 1 1/2 cups of flour, 3 level teaspoons of baking powder, 1 level tablespoon of sugar, and 1 saltspoon of salt. To 1 cup of boiled hominy, add 2 tablespoons of melted butter and 1 cup of milk. Add to the dry ingredients and beat. Then add 2 well-beaten eggs. Pour the batter into hot greased gem pans and bake. Muffins. Sift a saltspoon of salt, 2 level teaspoons of baking powder, and 2 cups of flour together. Beat the yolks of 2 eggs, add 1 cup of milk, 2 tablespoons of melted butter, and the dry ingredients. Beat, add lightly the stiffly beaten whites of 2 eggs. Fill hot buttered gem pans 2/3 full and bake in a hot oven. Quick muffins in rings. Beat 2 eggs, yolks and whites separately. Add to the yolks 2 cups of milk, 1 level teaspoon of salt, 1 tablespoon of melted butter, and 2 cups of flour in which 2 level teaspoons of baking powder have been sifted, and last the stiffly beaten whites of the eggs. When well mixed, bake in greased muffin rings on a hot griddle. Turn over when risen and set, as both sides must be browned. Boiled rice muffins. To make muffins with cooked rice, sift 2 1/4 cups of flour twice with 5 level teaspoons of baking powder, 1 rounding tablespoon of sugar, and a saltspoon of salt. Put in 1 well-beaten egg, 1/2 cup of milk, and 3/4 cup of boiled rice mixed with another 1/2 cup of milk, and 2 tablespoons of melted butter. Beat well, pour into hot gem pans, and bake. Boston brown bread. To make 1 loaf, sift together 1 cup of cornmeal, 1 cup rye meal, and 1 cup of graham flour, with 3/4 cup of molasses and 1 3/4 cup sweet milk. Add 1/2 teaspoonful of soda dissolved in warm water. Turn into a well-buttered mold, which may be a 5-pound lard pail if no other mold is handy. Set on something that will keep mold from bottom of kettle, and turn enough boiling water to come halfway up to the mold. Cover the kettle and keep the kettle boiling steadily for 3 1/2 hours. If water boils away, add enough boiling water to keep the same amount of water in kettle. Put in molds and cut when cool. Crisp white corn cake. 2 cups scalded milk, 1 cup white cornmeal, 2 level teaspoons salt. Mix the salt and cornmeal and add gradually the hot milk. When well mixed, pour into a buttered dripping pan and bake in a moderate oven until crisp. Serve cut in squares. The mixture should not be more than 1/4 inch deep when poured into pan. Croutons. Croutons made coarsely are no addition to a soup. For the best sort, cut out stale bread into 1/2 inch slices, spread with butter, then trim away the crust. Cut into small cubes, put into a pan and set in a hot oven. If the croutons incline to brown unevenly, shake the pan. Egg bread. 1 pint of boiling water, 1/2 pint white cornmeal, 2 teaspoons salt, 2 tablespoonfuls of butter, 2 eggs, 1 cup milk. Bake in a moderate oven. Graham bread. Put 1 cup of scalded and cooled milk, 1 cup of water, 2 cups of flour, and 1/2 yeast cake dissolved in 1 cup of lukewarm water into a bowl and let rise overnight. In the morning add a level teaspoon of salt, 2 rounding cups of graham flour, and 1/2 cup sugar. Beat well, put into 2 pans and let rise until light and bake 1 hour. Nut bread. 1 1/2 cups of white flour, 2 cups of graham flour, 1/2 cup of cornmeal, 1/2 cup of brown sugar and molasses, 1 pint of sweet milk, 1 cup of chopped walnuts, 2 teaspoons of baking powder, 1/2 teaspoon of salt. Bake in a long pan for 3/4 of an hour. Oatmeal bread. Over a pint of rolled oats pour a quart of boiling water. When cool, add 1 teaspoonful suet, 1 teaspoon butter, 1/2 cup of molasses, and 1/2 yeast cake dissolved in a little water. Stir this thoroughly, and then add 2 quarts sifted flour. Do not knead this and allow it to rise overnight, and in the morning stir it again, and then put it in well-buttered bread pans. Let it rise until it fills the pans and then bake in a moderate oven. It takes a little longer to bake than white bread. Oatmeal bread. Cook 1 cup of rolled oats in water for serving at breakfast, and 1 cup of molasses, 1 1/2 cups of lukewarm water in which is dissolved 1 yeast cake and 1 teaspoon of salt. Mix in enough flour to make a stiff dough, cover and let rise. When very light, stir down, put in pans, let rise light, and bake in a slow oven. The heat should be sufficient at first to check the rising, then the baking should be slow. Oriental oatmeal bread. Take 2 cupfuls of rolled oats, put in bread pan, turn on 4 cupfuls of boiling water, stir for a while. Add, while hot, a heaping tablespoonful of lard, or 1 scant tablespoonful of butter and 1 of lard, 2 teaspoonfuls of salt, and 4 tablespoonfuls of sugar, and 3 of molasses. Now add 2 cupfuls of cold water, making 6 cups of water in all, and if cool enough, add 1 yeast cake dissolved in a very little water. Now stir in all the white flour it will take until it is as stiff as you can manage it with the spoon. Set in warm place overnight, and in the morning with spoon and knife fill your tins part full, let rise to nearly top of pan, then bake an hour for medium-sized loaves. Raisin bread. Scald 3 cups of milk and add 1 teaspoon of salt and 2 tablespoons of sugar. Cool and add 1/2 yeast cake dissolved in 1/4 cup of lukewarm water. Mix in enough flour to make a drop batter and set to rise. When this sponge is light, put in 2 cups of seeded raisins and enough flour to make a soft dough, but stiff enough to knead. Let rise again, then mold into 2 loaves. Let the loaves double in size and bake slowly, covering with another pan for the first 20 minutes of baking. Steamed brown bread. Beat 1 egg light, add 1 cup of cornmeal, 1 cup rye meal, and 1 1/2 cups of sifted flour with a 1/2 level teaspoon of salt. Add 1 cup of molasses, and after it is turned out, put in 1 level teaspoon of soda and fill with boiling water. Add to the other 1/3 cup more of the water. Pour into well-buttered mold and steam 4 hours. Southern corn cake. Mix 2 cups of white cornmeal, a rounding tablespoon of sugar, and a level teaspoon of salt. Then pour enough hot milk and water to moisten the meal well, but not to make it of a soft consistency. Let stand until cool, then add 3 well-beaten eggs and spread on a buttered shallow pan about 1/2 inch thick. Bake in a quick oven, cut in squares, split and butter while hot. Steamed cornbread. Sift together 1 cup of cornmeal and flour and a level teaspoon of salt. Put 1 level teaspoon soda in 1 tablespoon of water. Add to 1/2 cup of molasses and stir into the meal with 1 2/3 cups of milk. Beat and turn into a greased mold. Steam 4 hours, take off the lid of the mold and set in the oven 15 minutes. Steamed graham bread. Put into a mixing bowl 2 cups of sour milk, 1 cup of molasses, 1 level teaspoon of salt, 2 of soda, and then enough graham flour to make a batter as stiff as can be stirred with a spoon, adding 1/2 cup of seeded raisins. Pour into a 2-quart mold or lard pail well greased, Cover closely and set in a kettle of boiling water that comes 2/3 the depth of the mold. Cover the kettle and keep the water boiling constantly for 4 hours. Whole wheat bread. Scald 1 cupful of milk and 1 teaspoonful of butter, 1 of salt, 1 cup of water, and 1 tablespoonful of sugar. When lukewarm, add half a cake of compressed yeast dissolved in a little water and enough wheat flour to make a thin batter. Beat vigorously until smooth and let rise until very light. Add as much whole wheat flour as you can beat in with a spoon. Pour into greased tins, let rise until light, and bake in moderate oven for 1 hour. Asparagus fritters. Make a thick sauce with 1/2 cup of milk, 1 rounding tablespoon of butter, and 1/4 cup of flour. Stir in 1 cup of cooked asparagus tips and cool. Add 1 beaten egg and cook on a hot buttered griddle in small cakes. Corn fritters. 1/2 can corn, 1/2 cup flour, 1/2 level teaspoon baking powder, 1 level teaspoon salt, a dash of cayenne, and 1 egg. Chop the corn fine and add the flour, sifting with the baking powder, salt, and cayenne. Add the egg yolk well beaten and fold into the white beaten stiff. Drop by spoonfuls into hot fat 1/2 inch deep. Turn once while cooking. When done, drain on brown paper and serve. Crumb griddle cakes. Soak 1 pint of breadcrumbs in 1 pint of sour milk for an hour. Then add a level teaspoon of soda dissolved in 1 cup of sweet milk, and 1 well-beaten egg, half a teaspoon of salt, and flour enough to make a drop batter as thick as griddle cakes are usually made. Hominy cakes. To 2 cups of boiled hominy, add 2 tablespoons of melted butter. Break the whole very fine with spoon or fork. Add 2 well-beaten eggs, 1/3 teaspoon of salt, and a saltspoon of pepper. Form into little cakes after adding enough milk to make it of the right consistency to handle. Set cakes on buttered dish and dust with a little finely grated cheese. Bake in hot oven and serve at once. Oatmeal cake. Mix fine oatmeal into a stiff dough with warm water. Roll it to the thinness almost of a wafer. Bake on a griddle or iron plate placed over a low fire for 3 or 4 minutes, then place it on edge before the fire to harden. This will be good for months if kept in a dry place. Pineapple pancakes. Make a batter using 1/2 pound sifted flour and 3 good-sized eggs with a cupful of milk. This makes a very thin batter. When smooth and free of lumps, bake in a well-buttered frying pan, making the cakes about 8 inches in diameter. As soon as brown on one side, turn. When cooked on both sides, remove to a hot serving dish and sprinkle with sweetened pineapple. Bake the remainder of the batter in the same way, piling in layers with the pineapple between the cakes. Cut in triangular pieces like pie and serve very hot. Squash fritters. 2 cups of mashed dry winter squash. Add 1 cup of milk, 2 well-beaten eggs, 1 teaspoon of salt, a little pepper, and 1 heaping teaspoon of baking powder. Beat well and drop by spoonfuls into hot butter or cooking oil, and fry. End of section 13.